Hello, everyone, and welcome to Component Documentation Made Easy. So I'm Bart, as Ben mentioned, and I am from Chicago. I help run the Vue.js meetup down there. I occasionally blog on Alligator, alligator.io, and I help maintain Storybook and Vue Styleguidist. But that's a little bit enough about me. I'd like to know a little bit about you. So raise your hand if you're a designer. Is there? Oh, not that many. Raise your hand if you're maintaining a library or if you're actually maintaining a design system, any library, even internal. Vuetify, Bootstrap, Cool, there's plenty of them. Amazing. And raise your hand if you're actually using one of those libraries. Yeah, there you go. So that's basically all of this talk is about all of you. And so just to help me here, personify a bit those people, the roles are going to be personified by Dominic, who is the designer, Sarah, who is the design systems engineer, and Phil, who is the final product developer. So he's using the libraries. And if you don't remember the names, just look at those letters. It should be fine. Oh, cool. So overall, why is it so important that someone would actually write a talk about documentation? Well, it's all about this. You don't want to be handed over a blurg. So yes, a blurg is this creature. For those who have not seen The Mandalorian, great show, by the way, so a blurg is a wild creature that Mando, the Mandalorian, gets to cross the Badlands. And before he can use it, he has to tame it. We do not want to tame components before we can use them. It's usually those obscure props that you go in and you're like, why? What? And so basically, this is why it is so dear to me to actually document components. But the trick is, what the next thing Mendo says is, oh, I don't have time for this. So we actually don't have time for this. He actually says that he wants a land speeder or a speeder bike. So that's actually kind of what we want. We'd prefer a speeder bike than the blurg. But overall, Sarah, who is the developer for this design system, says, I don't have time for this either. Basically, we're all in the same boat. We all have deadlines. It does not work like this. But Sarah is a clever girl. She's a clever engineer, and she knows computers can help her a lot. What can they help us the most with? Well, automation. It's mesmerizing, right? This picture I took, I just completely stole from Machine Pix. Super good Twitter feed. Anyway, automation, and more specifically, what documentation can be automated. And for this, Sarah uses two libraries, Storybook and Vue Styleguidist. So we're going to see those two libraries, and then what we're going to do is we're going to have, for each of those, a quick demo of how they work. So the first thing we want to introduce is how Sarah and Dominic can interact. We all know how Dominic, the designer, can give designs to Sarah over, here's a sketch, but you could use Figma, Photoshop, even like drawings on a wall, handing off designs is usually an easy task, and that's not what we are focusing on anyway today. But the other way around is more of a question. Before Storybook, that we're going to see in a moment, Dominic had to wait for the components that he asked Sarah to build to be implemented by Phil in the final product. And that's super long. He had to wait for sometimes three weeks to actually get two or even 2 or 3 sprints to actually get any feedback about the components he built. Well, with Storybook, what you get is a component documentation, a component examples documentation in pure isolation. So you don't get the components inside of your app, but you get it inside of a little nest that is protected, like a little bit of a paddock, if you will, to take back the idea of the blurg. So now that we have Storybook, so in order to install it, if you add Storybook, we all love of the Vue CLI. If you don't know about it, you should probably check it out, the CLI, I mean. But if you have a project running the Vue CLI, you can just run Vue add Storybook. And what you get once you click Vue add Storybook is you get this. So on the left, you get a list of stories that have been written by Sarah for Dominic. You get the rendering of those stories in the middle, and a way to interact with those stories down there. So let's see how Sarah writes those stories. So just besides or around, like in her code base, she adds a new file. So this is the stories for a button. And she has those stories. And so on the top, you see that you basically import those components. And then you export some metadata in the middle and the default, just to give it a name and to give it like a kind of a group. And at the end, you just export a function, an arrow function, that will display the story. It's basically just a use case for your components. So if it does not ring a bell, let me give you a quick demo. So let's see, is everyone visible? So the quick scenario here is that Dominic has asked Sarah to build a new color to a button. So we've seen the button being blue by default, and now we're going to see it running green. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start Storybook. Just checking that is it? Oh, it might actually not be running on the wrong one. Yeah. So when you click on Storybook, it actually opens immediately in your browser. And so normally it should be opening soon. There you go. So you have to be careful if you have like multiple browsers opened, because it's going to open in the last one you've clicked in. So here we are. We have Storybook. So we've added this. So Sarah is super happy. She has added this new color to the button. But as we see here, the two stories that are documented so far are the default color and the red color. So now she wants to add this. So let's see what we have here. We have, this is the, you know what? So I'm going to find the button stories. So here we have a default color and a with color red. So we actually find that it's super nice because it actually parses your titles and takes the Pascal case and make it like separate words, so you don't have to think about this. But now we have a default button, a red button, and what we want to add here is the green story. So let's just add this. So we are just going to take this story here. Of course, it's not happy because I can't export twice the same value. And so now, if I go and save this, what happens is I get this new story, this new object here in the main menu. And for now, it's still red, because as you see here, I have not changed this. But you get this new story immediately. And of course, you get hot module replacement, so you don't need to restart Storybook every time you add a new story. That would be not very, very, very 2020. And so if you want to just test your components like this, completely in isolation once again, you don't need to refresh your components or to think about how you're going to implement it inside of your complete project. Let's have a bit of a more involved story here. So we saw a bit about Bulma this morning in the state of CSS. And so this is the date picker from Bulma. So I built a quick basic story about it. And so I'm going to once again go stories here. What? Ah, yeah, I know why. And so I created a quick date picker story here, so the basic that you see here and here. And there is a prop that I found a bit hard to grok a little bit. So I said, well, let's try to figure out what close on click does. So let's see what close on click does. close on click is one of those props that is a bit backwards. So basically, it's a prop that is true by default. So if you do close on click, so I'm going to do close on click here, the story once again appears. And when you click on it, it still closes. But what we want here is to make it close on click equals false. So what happens when I do close on click equals false? Boom. It's not closing when I close. So it allowed me to test super fast one of the props just by creating a new story. And more importantly, it allowed Sarah to talk to Dominic without having to implement the components completely. So especially in big teams and when you have big projects, you don't want to have the design feedback loop to be super, super, super long. A couple of other things here that we can see. There is a lot of tools here that you see, a bar that allows you to have like those stories in full screen. You can have a lot of actions and how things are loaded. So in here you see that there has been input done on this value. And you can open the canvas using this. You can open the canvas in a new tab using this click. This is actually super important for us Vue users because Storybook basis is iframe. The isolation of those components here is made using an iframe. So this canvas here is a pure iframe. Problem with iframes with the Vue dev tools today is that they don't go through. So if you want to be able to debug your components using the Vue dev tools, you probably want to eject the iframe outside of the main canvas. So that's it for the demo of Storybook. So just let's recap before we go anywhere else. So it is incredibly popular. So if you don't believe me, believe NPM, 6 million downloads per month on the React version, 400,000 on the Vue version, so super popular. Great team behind it. And well, if you don't believe me, believe them. That's quite a set of logos. Another thing is that it gets it completely isolated. So your components are completely isolated from the rest of the CSS. So if you have CSS for the settings around, you don't get anything bad. It has a slick design. So we've seen about this. Like you can like it or not, but it's definitely well defined, and the identity is super nice. I love it. Because it's super popular, there is a lot of knobs and add-ons. Like there is a lot of add-ons that will allow you to do accessibility. Like Maria was saying, it's super important to be able to check those components for accessibility. It will not give you information about are you using properly, but it will tell you, for instance, when an image does not have an alt, or it will tell you a couple of items like this. And last point that I want to make for Storybook is that it's actually maintained by a company. It started as a completely open source project, and because a company was building its own business model around Storybook, what happened was that they started hiring people to do it full time. So there is, I think, 6 or 7 developers that are, maybe 5, anyway, a couple of developers that are actually working full time on Storybook and are making sure that it's amazing. There is a couple caveats. Not everyone likes JSX. Everything is developed in React, and so if all the paradigms of React are a bit there still in the Storybook area, so you might actually want to brush a little bit on your JSX skills. And of course, the Vue dev tools needing detach is not very, very super cool for demos like mine. So yeah, usually it's a bit of a puzzle. Like why can't I see my component? Oh, I just need to detach the center view, the canvas. So now, Sarah and Dominic are super happy. Sarah has been able to talk to Dominic and tell him, well, this is what you get. These are the components. They are validated. Everybody likes it. Now, the trouble is Phil comes in and he sees the examples and he's like, yeah, I like those examples. I would like to make my own now. Well, there is a couple of things missing now, because there is no explanation of, there is a good explanation of what the components are actually looking like when they're rendered, but no explanation of what other props are going to be there, or how to use those components, or where to use those components. And so, we need a bit more context. So what Styleguidist does, once again, super easy to add using the CLI. What Styleguidist does is it parses your components and looks for all those props, slots, events, and even public methods, and builds a documentation, a website off of it. So when you install Styleguidist in a library like mine, you get here on the left list of components. So you'll notice that it looks a little bit like Storybook, but there is a nuance here. The list on the left is not stories. It is exactly what you get when you install it. So it's a zero config thing. This is exactly what you get when you get zero config. In the middle, this list of props, methods, events, and slots. So you get a list of all the documented props. So when you install it with the CLI plugin, you actually get a kind of a fake component that I just add there just to show how to document props, events, and slots. And at the bottom here, you get the live editor. So if it does not ring too many bells, just wait for the demo. But this is probably my favorite part about Styleguidist. So the first thing we want to focus on is how do we document props. And I know I've seen this way of documenting during the lightning talks. So if you want to document this prop, if you want to describe what the color does, what you can do is just add a property, like a JS doc in there. And using this, you will actually get exactly this. So if you want to set the background color of the button, this is how you will document it. So this is how you document a prop. But you document it as JS doc, so this is pretty easy. But now you see this slot on the top. Well, imagine now that you want to document this slot. You don't want to have to create a render function to document this slot. So we just took the same format to build documentation, and now we can comment slots as well. And we can do the same, of course, for props inside of the template, for events that are emitted directly inside of the template. And so, overall, this is how it works. If you don't get it too much right now, I'll give you a demo once again. So, oh yeah, same thing. So this is the last version, so it has a nice progress bar. I wanted to show it off. So what you've seen before was like the raw version of Styleguidist. But here, so on the left here, what you see is the list of components that you have and free text pages. So what are free text pages? Well, very often when you're building a documentation, you don't want to throw people raw, here are my components. So in here, I have this getting started page that I can, that is just basically a README. And you can actually have it pointing to your README. So this is just Markdown. So all of this code is actually written in Markdown. So it's super easy to make it work with normal CMS. We were talking about Ghost CMS this morning, I think, about the next talk. Anyway, so the idea is that you can have those components. But now, let's see what buttons are about. So we see here that we, so let's make this a bit smaller so that the left disappears. Yeah. All right. So we see here that we have now documented a new property. So if we take, again, the scenario of Storybook, where Dominic asked to add a new color to the list of colors available for the buttons. Now, what we can do here is say, OK, well, what are the valid values using the add values here? What are the valid values for this component that you see here? So red, blue, and we just added, I believe, green. So we're going to add green. And so what happens now, of course, because there is HMR once again, hot module replacement, you get immediately the documentation updated. But the next part, which is to me a bit more important, is that you can actually immediately start testing this new property. So we're going to go color equals, and then without having to create a new story, we're going to come in and be able to test the new prop that we've just created without having any involvement. So this is just the default example. I have not even written one line to build the documentation for this component. I've not written one line of Markdown. If I wanted to, I can use Markdown and those props here in those descriptions. So any kind of Markdown would actually work. If you go links or anything like this, it would still work. But overall, what we want here is to focus on the component itself. What we can do, though, and this is where things can be, sorry about that. So what we can do here is augment. So basically, augment this this button documentation with actual proper component documentation. And so this is just taken from the Carbon documentation. And what I have here is I can add a new block at the bottom, which is called docs. Who here has ever used the docs block before? Yeah, it's actually not well known, but weirdly enough, if you open Feature, docs block are the only block that is supposedly custom that works out of the box. So in here, I don't even have a plugin for Feature. And if I do docs/docs, and I paste the Markdown that I have, as you can see, syntax highlighting is already working fine. And so if I save this, I get the documentation immediately here. So if I give now the components to Phil, if Sarah hands this off to Phil, well, Phil has a bit more guidance about how to use the button. He's not like completely with a blurb. And as you can see here, the examples that I have here, so it's basically this here. So every single piece of code that you put in between fences, so this is those three backticks that you have here. Every single piece of code that you put in those braces, like in those fences, will be rendered automatically. And this is a Vue template, so by default you can have a Vue template. You can have actually way more involved tools like requires and all that. But where the tool shines more, I think, is with more complicated components. And let's take again the date picker that we had before. So we have this date picker. You remember you pick a date. Oops, it just closed immediately. So we have this here, this button, and so we have this close and click property once again. We can test it super quickly, but that's not very. That's not exactly the most shiny thing that we can have. Yeah, maybe I should try learning to type. And so once again, boom, we've tested it. And so in a matter of minutes, even if the property has no story yet, we can already test all those properties live inside of the tool. So we don't have to come back in and rewrite one story for each of those components. And that's a bit better for writing components because immediately, for free basically, just by installing Styleguidist, you get all those props parsed inside of your documentation, and you can test them out. But now let's see. There is another thing about this date picker. So if I look here, I see that there is a lot of properties, of course, and there is two slots. There is the header. Well, it's kind of obvious, like we all know what the header is. But what is this default thing? Let's look it up. Let's see what it does. So if I go here, what is in my default? And I can go here and go bdate picker. And say, and now what I can see here is I can see, oh, this is what the, okay, so it's basically the footer. So, maybe it could have been named footer, but that's another story. At least now we know what this property does, and what this slot does. So, because we're nice, we're going to document it. We're nice people, so let's see. Date picker view. And so there is a slot here, down. There, here is our slot. So we're going to just document it. So let's close. Oh, yeah, you can close it if you, yeah. There you go. So it's a comment. So of course, add slot, and then this holds the footer. And so since this is all HMR, oops. Since it's all HMR, now you see that the documentation has immediately updated. So, overall, there is a couple of advantages to work in this. The last one being that even if I stop the server here, the documentation is still live. And if I go here and I do this, so if I continue updating the tools, you don't need the server for the live refresh to happen. So what does this bring? Well, this brings something that is a bit new to the table, which is that you have your documentation, and basically a bit for free, you have like what Bootstrap Vue has, and I believe the Vueify documentation has, a complete documentation with a live rendering engine inside of your documentation. So basically for free, you get all this. And then you can involve progressively developers into the documentation. You can have designers like Dominic come in and add more comments about color, the color theory, why to use a button, where to go from here, what should be the voice and tone of your application. So this is Styleguidist. Let's review quickly what the items of Styleguidist are. Come on. So we have this automated props parsing. We have default examples. We have documentation in code. So we've seen that directly we can use the component files to document those. It works with Vue components, but with Vue files. But of course, it works very, very well with JS and JSX objects. You get this live editor directly in your documentation. You get free Markdown pages. And as you've seen, theming is pretty easy. I could actually, you've seen that theming can be pretty extensive. I'll actually show you maybe, if you're interested, I can show you how easy it is to theme, but there is a whole HMR tool that allows you to change all the colors, the dimensions, and even the components. But there is a couple of downsides. One is that JSDoc can be super verbose. So if you have a component that is about 3,000 lines long, well, add the docs and you're actually at 9,000. Sometimes you just have to cut the components. And in this case, yeah, JSDoc is verbose, especially because we add this / at the beginning, and well, there is 2 lost lines there. Another issue which Storybook does not have is because we're not in complete isolation, because we don't have the iframe, if you have a component that is position fixed, you cannot actually properly test it inside of Styleguidist. And it actually gives you a couple of issues. And the whole tool is still built in React. So we're still working out with React. But you remember at the beginning of the talk is actually called Component Documentation Made Easy. Well, I still gave you 2 libraries. That's a bit involved. And I told you that both of them are using React, and I gave you the fact that a lot of them have downsides. Well, how about we try to make it even easier. Storybook, the main team that we were talking about before, Chromatic QA, has come up with Storybook Docs. Well, Storybook Docs is basically a fusion, like Dragon Ball style, fusion of Storybook and Styleguidist. So what it does is it allows you to import your stories that you're very happy with inside of your documentation. So instead of writing your stories twice, instead of stories inside of JS files and inside of the Markdown files, you actually just import those stories inside of MDX. For those who don't know, MDX is Markdown with JSX code inside. So you've seen how JSX stories are written. Well, MDX is basically those JSX stories in there. But because we are now Markdown with JSX inside, we can use free text pages. Woo-hoo. We can have as well, because it's documentation, props and slots for the components that we have. So of course, props, slots, events, and methods. And once again, we can get theming. So they have a lot of traction with this tool because, of course, they are very well known. We've seen the logos. And so a lot of the logos that we've seen before are using Storybook Docs to build their documentation. So that's pretty awesome. But once again, we're still using React. So if you look at how Styleguidist works today, it takes Vue components, puts it inside of a React, it creates like a quick object, puts it into a React website, and then you get your style guide. But Jessica Sachs and a couple of other, I think Puya from the Nux team, are working right now super hard to get to this. Vue.gen CLI creates Markdown files. So you get Markdown files with the props and everything in there. You get a live tool that renders, and then you get to choose the rendering. So today, inside of the Vue Styleguidist repo, you can actually find an example of how to use Vue.gen CLI with VuePress. But for now, we've been seeing that VuePress has some struggle trying to get customized. So when you want to customize the shape of how VuePress works, it's a bit involved, whereas Nuxt has so much more good things to do. So now we can have a complete website rendered inside of Vue. So if you want to customize it, you don't have to go through React. And we do it completely through Next. So Markdown will be rendered through Markdown for Nuxt, and then you actually get your style guide completely in Vue. So if you want to use your components inside of your documentation to make your documentation, you can do this automatically. And it's still using the exact same format of documentation that was the good one for Styleguidist and for Storybook Docs. So don't worry, your documentation inside of the components is not going anywhere because everything is actually built on the same core tools. So my talk was not complete until there was a Baby Yoda in there, of course, the Baby Yoda show thing. Overall, if you have one thing to take out of my talk is this. If you don't document your components, well, they won't be used. And if they're not used, you've worked for nothing. But since it takes so long to write the documentation, probably you should try to automate as much of it as you can. So yeah, avoid the blurg. This is the way. That's it for me. Thank you very much, and have a good conference.